Welcome to this Erasing Shame episode. My name is DJ Chuang. I'm here with Pastor John Shin. Welcome.
Hello, DJ. It's good seeing you. Thanks for having me on the pod.
In this episode, we literally will be talking about erasing shame and how that affects our mental health, and especially in Korean American, Asian American, multi-ethnic churches that have Asian Americans, all of that mixed, because that's where many churchgoers, well, that's where the churchgoers go. I mean, it's either Asian American church, Korean American church, or multi-ethnic churches, right? I think that covers them all.
Yeah, I think, well, again, depends what generation you're talking about, but for our parents, definitely church was the place to be to try to find that comfort. That was kind of the only place they could go to because of the language barrier to find other Koreans. And so
Yes.
for our parents, for our immigrant parents, for sure, the church
Right.
was the place to be at.
Well, I was just reading a report yesterday. 70% of Korean Americans go to church.
Yeah, that
That's
makes
way
total
higher
sense.
than in South Korea, which is like 20, just under 25% now, and declining.
Yeah, declining. Church is going down over there. It's pretty sad.
But with Korean Americans, 70% churched. That doesn't mean they're necessarily all, sold out Christians and all that, but many are. Over 4,000 Korean American churches in America, maybe 200, 300 some that are predominantly Korean American English speaking, which is a subcategory of all of that. And you're Korean American yourself, and you're currently serving as pastor at Saddleback Church, Irvine South campus. How many years has it been?
8 years.
Wow, you're coming up on double digits. That's going to be a huge milestone.
Yeah.
You intend to reach 10, maybe 20?
10, I hope. 20, gosh, it's all up to the Lord. I'm just
Yes.
in the moment and whatever the Lord tells me to do. But I mean, like you said, 8 is actually a huge milestone because it's not typical. People stay that long at a church, and it's not for bad reasons. People get called out to different places. And so, yeah, I am one of the longer running guys in my role for sure.
Now, in my conversations with pastors, both Asian and non-Asian, I do find Asian and Asian American pastors have longer tenures than non-Asian pastors. So it is not unheard of for pastors to be at a place for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, whereas for American pastors, non-Asian American pastors, 2 to 3 years, 5 years, they're hopping around to another place. Have you noticed that yourself?
Are you talking about like in the Asian church, like Korean church?
Yeah, Korean, Asian
Yeah, I
American,
think I
right?
think if you're like in an adult role, that's
Uh-huh.
probably more common. But
Okay.
if you're like in more of an education role, like elementary or youth, I think you'll see more of
Mm,
less time frame, like a 3 year
mhm.
typical time frame, because you're usually like in your young mid 20s, and then after you graduate seminary, it's kind of common that they want to move on to like something else. But if you get to like an adult role, yeah, I do think longevity is much more common when it gets to Korean churches and Korean church pastors being in those roles for much longer, for sure.
Mhm. Yeah, and you're just to mention what you're also doing currently, you're hosting a podcast yourself.
Yeah,
Tell us about that one.
it's really fun. It's kind of like what I call the English speaking arm of a Korean seminary. So there's a Korean seminary here in Santa Fe Springs, which is kind of the borderline of Cerritos, and they have asked me to help them build out an English speaking MDiv program.
Mm,
And so this seminary is really well known with Korean speaking people, but they want English speaking Koreans to attend because the vision here is to try our best. And I'm laughing because if you're Korean, you're going to know what I'm talking about. We're going to try our best to build a healthy bridge between first and second, now even third generation
mm,
Korean and Korean Americans. We're talking like the immigrant Korean speaking Koreans and
mhm,
the English speaking Korean Americans. There's been
mhm,
a long divide in the Korean church between first and second gen. And this school is going to try to bring both of them from the same church to the same school. And we're going to try our best not only to train them theologically and biblically, but to build a healthy bridge, how to have like a real relationship between these two cultures. And so this podcast was started based on that premise. I'm building awareness about a program, but building awareness about this issue that we've had for like last 30 years. So all we were talking about is a lot of Korean church ministry and a lot of first, second gen ministry issues, problems, and of course, resolutions. What's the future look like? And so it's been fun talking to a lot of our friends. You know, most of the guys that have been on there, and just talking a lot about, hey, let's see what we can do about this divide.
Yeah, go ahead and mention the name of the podcast and the link, and we'll add it in the show notes.
Yeah, the podcast is called Church in Culture. So youtube.com/@churchandculture, Instagram, same thing, @church and culture. I even got a Facebook page. And that's the video podcast. We are going to launch it on audio soon. Just I haven't had time. I'm a one-man production right now, so I'll rip the audio soon. But we're like 8 episodes in, and it's been great. It's been really fun talking to all our friends and being able to dig deep in some of these issues.
Well, we're going to dig deep on the shame aspect of all of that comes baked into our Asian American cultures. And in particular, there's perhaps a certain flavor that maybe kimchi enhanced in the Korean and Korean American cultures. We're doing this Joe Rogan style, so we're free-forming and stream of conscious, and so glad that you're a fellow podcaster and kind of can go with the flow on that. I don't have any set questions, so it's just whatever comes to mind. And so I thought that would be a good point of reference, just given your current situation, as well as how you're cultivating and curating these conversations among Korean and Korean American pastors. And since 70% of Korean Americans attend church, that's certainly a big part of our cultural context. And so describe what comes to mind, because this conversation came out of, hey, you've got a lot of experience with shame. We all do in different ways, especially as Asians and Asian Americans. What comes to mind when you hear the word shame?
Oh, DJ, so much. I think, again, I don't think in Korean culture it's anything new when we talk about shame in the broader context of Asian culture. But, you know, as a Korean, I think when you say shame, what comes to mind is this incredible kind of defense mechanism to suppress our shame. So our culture, Asian culture, you know, all culture, ancient cultures, we were really taught to kind of suppress shame. We don't want to expose that. In our cultures, you know, that there's a lot that deals with the family name. So we don't want to bring shame to our parents. So as a child growing up, you know, we did not feel comfortable confessing or making mistakes or talking to our parents. I mean, this is kind of broad. I think every family's different, but typically we never really were comfortable enough to talk to our parents about mistakes and things that we did. And of course, when we did make a mistake, the common resolution for our parents was, like, don't let anyone know, don't let anyone find out, and fix it right away because of that shame in our culture. And so as a child, we were always taught to suck it up. There's this Korean word that we always use in Korea, where it's called chamo. Chamo means to just like suck it up, just like hold it in, suppress. And usually you use that word where, like, when you're in pain, you know, like, just suck it up. But that word is also kind of related to shame, just like suck it up. Don't let anyone know. Don't bring further embarrassment to our family, and don't share. And I think as you grow up, you can become adults. We're not very vulnerable with each other. It's very difficult to share, even as Korean Americans. Again, I think, you know, every church is different. I'm sure there's small groups out there and churches out there that have cracked this code and are doing a really good job with it. But it's not common to be vulnerable and share about things that are going on because there's shame. Of course, now we're dealing with gossip and we don't want people to talk about us. So it's really difficult. I also think about our immigrant parents, for those who have immigrant parents who immigrated here from Korea, China, Japan, wherever it was from. You know, they had it even worse than us, because not only do they deal with the honor shame culture, but they didn't even have anyone to share it with. They immigrated here, had no friends. Typically, their family's still back in their mother country. And when they were struggling, they had no one to go to. Even within marriage, I think about
Mm,
my parents. I'm just wondering, gosh, like my mom, she probably never talked to anyone about her problems. It was
mm,
very typical for her to suppress and just suck it up and just deal with it on her own.
mm-hmm.
And gosh, thinking about that now, I'm just like, gosh, I think any one of us as Korean, Chinese Americans, those who were born and raised in
Mm-hmm.
America, we would probably go out of our mind if we never got to share with anyone. And unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of that coming out now, right? With social media. Now everyone feels
Yes.
comfortable. And I think it's a
Yeah.
good thing in one sense. We're getting more comfortable sharing, but it's like coming out like a volcano, right? Because
Oh
we've
yeah.
never done it. So it's almost like coming out in unhealthy ways where
Yes.
we're sharing, which is great, but sometimes we're sharing with a lot of anger and a lot of blaming, and um, the interpretation might not be correct, and now the resolution is not very good.
Yeah.
So
And
so much there within a lot of suppression in our culture.
yeah, I hear described as vomit.
Right.
We know how to vomit, but it's not a controlled sharing where it's uh, measured and appropriate. And when it's out of control, it doesn't help the person nor anybody else that's hearing it. And we can go back to the Bible. Shame starts right from the beginning, Genesis 3, where Adam and Eve hid.
Hid. Yep.
So there's very much the automatic instinct to hide and to suppress when we make a mistake or when we have shortcomings, whatever that might be, or in the case of mental health, mental illness, if we have challenges and struggles in life, because we're in a social context like Asian America or Korea, there's a lot of comparison and there's a lot of social status. And if you don't quite measure up to I don't know if they say the Joneses next door, I guess it would be the Kims and the Wongs next door.
Keeping up with the Kims.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up as a teenager hearing about the articles in the Chinese newspaper that my dad would read. It's like, hey, look at this 12-year-old that made it to MIT. What are you doing? Time and time again, that was the story I heard growing up. That
I think this is a key thing that a lot of our white American friends don't understand, which is there is shame. There's shame here and there's shame there, shame in different cultures. But for us, it's like a little bit of a double or triple whammy because of the
Mhm,
immense pressure academically that we had. We had
mhm,
such pressure to be successful, to get straight A's, to be a doctor, to be like a kid who went to MIT. And so now we're living under this immense pressure. So again, it gets even harder for us to deal with failure and mistakes and shame, and we don't want to disappoint our parents or even share because we know we're going to yelled at. So there's so many other cultural nuances,
mhm.
uh, things in our culture that were very difficult for us growing up.
Yeah. And what what do we do with that? What hope does the gospel give us? And how can we help? Well, I have several directions that I could go with this, but first one is how can the gospel help us? Second, how do we help someone like you, pastors who are in a position where there's so much reverence for respect for the role, which kind of bleeds over into reverence, where the pastor cannot show um, their humanity when they struggle with the everyday challenges of life. And COVID has been such a challenging season for those of you that are in ministry. What thoughts come to mind?
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is, I've said this a lot in the podcast in Church and Culture, where I
Mm,
think as a second gen Korean American, we never really were taught or even learned what it really meant to be Korean American. We lived our whole life in this dual culture, but not just dual as in two, but a dueling culture, two cultures that were
mm,
dueling against each other. I
mhm,
was Korean when I went home. I was American when I went to school. I went back to being Korean when I went to Korean church.
mhm,
It was such a hard thing for us to go back and forth. I think that's why a lot of us had a hard time with our immigrant parents, because we were learning all these American values, American principles,
Mm-hmm.
but then our Korean parents didn't understand those things. They were raised in Korea. So
Mm-hmm.
it was like, well, is this wrong? Why is it wrong? I don't get it. This is what I'm learning in school. And so because we never really unpacked that, I think it would be a really good starting point if you're Korean American to start learning about that. Like, what does it mean to be a Korean American? It's so funny because a lot of us, we're parents now, and we are all trying to like raise our kids in American culture, and it's almost reactionary. We don't want to do what our parents did,
Mm-hmm.
but we're also losing a lot of the values of our culture and a lot of the values that our parents try to instill into us. Maybe they expressed it in bad ways, like academics, but the principle was still good. But some of us were so reactionary that we just kind of threw it all out, just threw out the baby with the
Okay.
bathwater.
Okay, let's slow down a minute there. So what's the good part of that academic thing?
I think the good thing is like, you should try in academics, right? I mean,
Okay.
that's not bad.
You want to put in a good effort, your best
Yeah.
effort, because
Why is that so bad? Why
Mm.
why is it bad to really raise your children to try hard in school? I think
Mhm.
the way that's expressed in a negative way was our parents said try hard, but it was like, it means you had to be perfect, right? A's in
Mm.
everything, and 1 A- you're a failure, and that's all you had to do. That's why we went to Kumon and did tutoring and all this stuff. So it's like, well, let's not put that pressure on. But yeah, I think it's really good to raise our kids to try hard in school, but we don't yell at them for getting a B-, right? We are just
Okay.
with them
Mhm.
as they are a student, because not everyone is good at studies, and that's okay, right? That's okay.
Mhm.
And so I think part of this is really understanding, like, what does it mean to be a Korean American and to understand our identity? But I think that only helps on an earthly level. On a gospel level,
Mhm.
I think we need to remember, and again, perhaps we never really spent a good amount of time doing this, that our identity is in Jesus. Our identity is in knowing that we are a child of God, here for the gospel kingdom, here
Mhm.
to follow him. I think one huge thing that I'm noticing in Korean Americans, second gen Korean Americans who are all now parents, these are people now in their late 30s and 40s and now
Mhm.
50s. One big thing that I am observing is I feel like we're losing that. We're losing our identity in Jesus. It looks like, and that's why this is such a superficial observation, because it's not like I talk to these people on a daily basis, but it looks like our identity is right back to academics and extracurricular activities, and
Mm.
make sure our kids play 5 sports, and wearing the right clothes and going out and having all the social fun. Now, none of that stuff is bad. It's not sinful, but I'm really curious, is that where your identity is in? And the reason why I question that is
Mhm.
because we see how the church is being sacrificed a lot. Like,
Mhm.
people are not going to church because of sports or doing these
Mhm.
things. And I see that, wow, it's really easy for some reason for all of second gen Korean American parents to sacrifice church so easily.
Mhm.
That worries me there a little bit.
Mhm.
So again, this is a very surface level observation. You got to go in depth into that. I'm not calling out all these parents who do these things, and I'm not trying to make them sound like, they're bad Christians or something like that. But it is a big thing. This is not how we grew up, and perhaps this is reactionary. This is maybe a reactionary thing that we think that it's not as bad. Like, our parents made us think that missing church once was like the end of our life, but maybe this is all reactionary. So going back to our identity in Jesus, but I think a huge part for us to understand our identity in Jesus, and I know this is something that most of us never learn or unpack, is what does that mean with shame?
Mhm.
How do I allow Jesus to take my shame, and so that he can take that shame upon himself
Mhm.
and kill it, to kill it on the cross, to cleanse it, and to maybe forgive it in one way, because perhaps it's
Mhm.
shame from sin. And how
Mhm.
can I do that in a peaceful and loving manner where I can accept that grace. And the reason
Mm-hmm.
why I said that I don't think many of us really learned how to do that is because our whole life we were raised to suppress shame. We were raised to swipe it under the rug, to
Mm-hmm.
not deal with it. And I
Mm-hmm.
think we never really had an opportunity to do that, to allow Jesus to take that shame for us. So, what does that look like? I think there's a lot of deep conversations. I think there's going to be a lot of crying. I think there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
healing and tapping
Mm-hmm.
into pain. But as Asians, we don't want to do that. It's all in the
Mm-hmm.
past. I don't want to deal with that. Let me just move
Mm-hmm.
forward. But we know that when you don't deal with it, that is still part of you. It's like almost like you
Yeah.
don't even know it anymore. It's more dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
So we really got to kind of get back to those dark moments sometimes and and let the Lord take that shame from us. I
Mm-hmm.
think a lot of it probably has to do with the shame and sin, those things that we've done in secret that we don't tell anyone about. I think there's a lot of shame that deals with our family, for
Mm-hmm.
sure, growing up as kids, things
Mm-hmm.
that we don't. Again, I think that's why our parenting is very different because we don't want to do we don't want our kids to experience what we experience. A lot of it is
Mm-hmm.
reactionary. So I think in those two areas, there's a lot of deep conversations that need to be had.
Well, I counted more than two, so there's a lot of areas where shame has affected our lives. The um, I'm not sure what that would look like. I mean, I want to believe what you said is true and right and good. What does it look like to actually experience Jesus taking our shame, covering our shame, washing us clean as white as snow, using the words right in the Bible, and bestowing upon us honor, the honor that God has for us because of what Jesus did on the cross. Um, I mean, the place that comes to mind is, well, I could probably confess that to my therapist and visit those dark places in the past. And by confessing our sin one to another, then our sin is released and relieved, and we receive healing that way. But as a pastor, how have you had moments where you've guided people beyond shame, erased shame, and towards more healing and freedom?
Okay, well, I think there's three things I would say. I wouldn't necessarily say that I've achieved all these things as a pastor. But I do want to share these three because you asked how do we do that. I think number
Mm-hmm.
one thing that you can easily do, and I
Mm-hmm.
think this totally works in Asian church because we're so high in discipleship, is to actually do an in-depth study on the theology of shame. That the theology
Ooh.
of shame is never
Mm.
again, this is my experience, right? So
Yeah.
I say these things and I feel like, okay, I'm not an expert, but in my experience, I feel like this is not a common topic. I never
No.
learned about the
No.
theology of shame in
Yeah.
seminary. I never heard about that at a church, especially at a Korean church. I
Mm-hmm.
think at this time, we have much more resources to be able to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So to do like an in-depth study on the theology of shame. I think there's a lot of fear in there too, theology of shame and
Mm-hmm.
fear and what that
Mm-hmm.
actually looks like. I think that works for those who are just kind of academics. They love discipleship. They want to get into a book and do that. That's not for everyone. I think
Mm-hmm.
another second thing is to cultivate a, a dynamic, a community where being vulnerable and being able to share is the norm. Now that's a
Wow.
big hill. That's a big uphill
Mm-hmm.
battle for our culture.
Mm-hmm.
But this helps us, especially in the Korean church, to move beyond just, again, superficial small groups where you're
Mm-hmm.
coming together, you're reading a book, and you kind of talk about like the Bible and stuff, but like there's no like real in-depth sharing what's going on in your life. I think it's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of like theology talk, maybe, but there is still this sense of, man, I don't know if I feel comfortable to share this with
Mm-hmm.
others. And I
Mm-hmm.
think we have to embed that into our small group system at the Korean church, at the Asian churches. How that happens, I don't know. Maybe it's training. Maybe it's like doing a vision casting series and
Mm-hmm.
preaching about it for 4 weeks, but
Mm-hmm.
really pushing that boundary. And I think it really does require both of those because it's such a huge uphill battle for our culture. That's not the norm for us.
Right.
It's not the norm to do that.
Yeah.
So preaching about it for 4 weeks,
Mm-hmm.
training our small groups to do that and to begin practicing that, even with simple guidelines. I think we were just doing this with our team at Saddleback. Like sometimes you have to have guidelines like, okay, this is how to share.
Yes.
It sounds so funny.
And I'm not sure Asians or non-Asians know how to share at that kind of level.
Like, okay, guys, this is how to share.
Mm.
These are the things you should not say. Don't interrupt. Don't try to solve the. This sounds so silly, but I think like some churches really need to explain these things because there is no culture of sharing. So I think that's another way that we can do that. I think the third way to do it, and I think this is the one thing that I have done as a pastor, is those one-on-ones. And to actually, it does take time, but to whether it's to give them permission to share, whether it's to let them know like this is a safe place, whether it's to let them know like, look, I know I'm a pastor, but I'm not sharing this with anyone, and I'm not going to try to like sell you on some curriculum or tell you to read a book. If you feel comfortable sharing, let's talk about that and giving them those opportunities to share. But I would add a caveat to that. I think most pastors like myself, we're not certified counselors. We don't know how to do that professionally. I think we're trained a little bit on how to get the ball rolling. But I think that pastoral moment leads to then a last idea on how to do this, which is encourage therapy and counseling. I think that's one huge thing that our generation is getting more comfortable with because you see that a lot more on social media. That's like my friends are like, I learned this in counseling. And you're like, whoa, like, I can't believe you share it to everyone you're going through counseling because we don't normally do that. We think like, oh, I can't let people know I'm getting counseling because then they think like, oh, is there something wrong in their marriage? What's happening? And we get really scared that maybe they think I'm not a good pastor anymore. But I think we're getting more comfortable with sharing about that with others and then encouraging other people to do it. And I do believe Koreans need to do more therapy and counseling. I highly recommend that.
Good words. Good words. And that's the premise here at Erasing Shame. We have these conversations to help people raise awareness, become more comfortable, come out of hiding, and make these conversations normal so that people do see examples of how counseling sounds like and looks like. We've had mock sessions here on the air. We've had counselors come through and share their personal stories. And there's something transformational about stories as we see it lived out and go from the textbook into the real lives of people. Then we can be encouraged and find the courage to take those steps for ourselves. It's one thing to see us on social media, so it's become common to talk about, but to actually have people take those steps is still a pretty big hurdle, is what the research is saying. And the data is saying. So suicide is the number one cause of death for young adults in America, among Asian Americans. And Japan and Korea have the highest suicide rates of developing countries. And so it's pandemic, endemic, crisis, how mental health is affecting us. And shame is a big part of that.
I was going to say, I just had Roy Kim on the podcast. I haven't uploaded yet. We're about maybe 2 weeks out from that. But gosh, I highly recommend anyone who's wants to learn more about like just shame and his story and testimony is one of those just buck wild stories that you're just like, oh my gosh, I can't believe it. And he's very vulnerable on the podcast. And we talk a lot about therapy and counseling on that. So for anyone who wants to learn more about that, please tune into that one. I'm going to be uploading that in 2 weeks. But again, like just talking to Roy, like I shared this on the podcast, but I did counseling with Roy, and I told him that I remember the day that I was about to call him. I was sitting on my living room couch and I had his number on my cell phone, and I just like, I can't believe I'm about to do this right now. It's all that shame. I
Mm-hmm.
was like, oh my gosh, what if someone finds out?
Mm-hmm.
What if someone like hears that like I'm getting counseling? What if they think I'm not a good pastor anymore? I was like sitting on my couch for like 15, 20 minutes.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
I just couldn't hit the send button to call because I was like so deathly afraid about what
Wow.
people might think.
Mm-hmm.
But it was great. Like I met with them
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it was such a good thing that I needed
Mm-hmm.
for my soul, for sure.
Oh, good to hear. Well, I'm glad you took that step of faith, that you're in a better place, and now you're able to share the abundant life that you've experienced with many, many more people. Well, thank you for taking the time to share with us here on the Erasing Shame podcast. Great to hear of your Church in Culture podcast. And any closing thought as we wrap up this episode?
Um,
Do we do
Gosh,
okay?
what was that?
Do we do okay?
No, I thought this was great. I thought we were gonna go for longer, DJ. We could keep on going. We don't have to close it out. But
Well,
maybe you need
I'm
to
out.
short.
I'm out. So
Oh, you're out. You're out of content.
yeah,
uh,
my brain is on a slow cycle today,
okay,
and
okay,
so I think I've shared with you, and many people here on the podcast know that I have mood swings.
yeah.
And so I've noticed today, and even as I'm revving up to talk with the great John Shin, I'm like,
Gosh,
okay,
no
my
way.
brain's not working at 100% today, but I know I can power through 30 minutes. I know you've got tons of energy. Oh, I was gonna say, with Korean pop culture being a global dominant force, how has that shaped being Korean American?
Yeah,
Because
like
it
I
was
think
not, I mean, I grew up, I'm 56, so I grew up where being Asian and Asian American was not cool. You wanted to
right,
hide that. It was shameful to be Asian American.
right.
Now, I mean, Korean is like top of the world. My goodness.
Yeah, and I think
Hasn't
that
that changed things?
it has a huge influence and factor in what's going on with shame,
Mm,
with being Korean American, with just our entire life because there's so many good and bad things about that. Like, yeah, like you said, it's like, oh my gosh, it's so much easier coming out and say like, yeah, I'm Korean, or like just listening to Korean music. And it's like crazy now. Like everyone is listening to this K-pop music. So it's really odd to see that. I think the reason why it could be bad though is because um it's almost like giving us this kind of like a reason to be more vocal about certain things. So like that's good, right? Like we're comfortable now, but it's not it's a kind of sometimes expressed in a bad way. Like we're being more vocal and coming out, but we're coming out with all that bad stuff, right? Like all that boiling, it's boiled over, and now we're so comfortable and coming out and ripping on our parents or whatever it is. There's
mm,
different Korean influencers
mhm.
that are now just kind of like being more comfortable. So it's a very interesting thing. But yes, that totally has huge influence on our shame and things like that. What I was gonna say here though at the end is that, gosh, DJ, I'm so thankful for you. I've known you for so long. You've known me since church planting days, and
Mhm.
I've had the privilege of mentoring your son Jeremiah. He was part
Yes,
of our
I wanna
church
thank you for
plant,
that. Yes.
and now he's part of Saddleback. And I just
Mhm.
feel so happy that I could continue just to be with him in ministry. And now he's on a peace trip right now, which is wild, right? He's on the other
That's
side
right.
of the world. So it's been such a joy seeing your son grow up, and that's been such a huge blessing for me. And just I just want to say thank you, DJ. I feel like I've known you for a long time, been able to learn a lot from you. And I think one thing that I would probably want to close out with again is this encouragement for all Korean Americans to seek therapy and counseling.
Mm,
And I want to really make sure they understand that, look, your pastor loves you, shepherds you,
mhm,
and it can be a counselor, but I don't think most of them can be a counselor for the long haul because they have 200 or 300 other people to think about.
mhm,
Their sole position is not just to be a counselor for you. So that's why I encourage them to, yeah, start it with your pastor if that's where you want to start. But
Mm-hmm.
you need to find someone who's certified, because that's the person that has time for you every single week.
Mm.
And I think that's what a lot of us need, like a weekly counseling session, weekly therapy, especially when it comes to marriage counseling. That's
Mm-hmm.
a huge one that I
Mm-hmm.
encourage people to do more of. But therapy, yeah, all the stuff that we grew up as kids, so many people have pain from their parents, from their own immigrant parents.
Yeah.
And so I just encourage
Yeah.
people to do that, to feel comfortable
Thank you.
doing that, and
Mm-hmm.
that it can be a gateway, a front door to a healing process. If you could find a Christian counselor, that would be great. I know that's not
Mm-hmm.
always easy. If you could find a Christian therapist, that would be great. I know it's not always easy. But yeah, I encourage people to do that more therapy, more counseling, and find people that you could be vulnerable with. If you can't be vulnerable in your small group, like change that culture. And if that culture is not going to change it, dude, get into a new small group. You got my small group.
Mm.
I'm a pastor at my church.
Mm-hmm.
My small group, we have a thread of the husbands. Gosh, I cannot tell you how thankful I am for those husbands, because I've shared with these guys some of my dark moments during the pandemic. And I
Mm-hmm.
cannot tell you how kind of it was so great to like just get that off my chest, to tell with them some of the things I'm struggling with.
Mm-hmm.
And these guys are like my brothers,
Wow.
and they don't
That's amazing.
they know I'm a pastor, but they don't have that same reverence like you said before. And it's not a bad thing. It's like, no, dude, I want us to just be brothers here, and that's what we are. And these four guys, I am so thankful for. I've shared with them some deep things. And
Mm-hmm.
if I didn't have that during the pandemic, I probably would have quit. I probably would have quit church. It was so
Oh.
bad for me. And
Oh.
so if you're in a small group and you can't have that, or maybe you're too
Mm-hmm.
embarrassed, or maybe it's not the culture, change that culture or find a new small group, because you got to have a place in the church, a safe place to share, and to have people walk with you in life. First, what is it? Thessalonians 5, I think it's for 14 through 16, like there are people who are idle in their faith. These are people
Mm-hmm.
who need encouragement. There's
Mm-hmm.
a people who need help. How that happens in the church. And we got to
Yes.
start practicing that more.
Mm-hmm.
And if church is just listening to good preaching and reading a good like R.C. Sproul book or something like that, if you're just learning and that's it, you got to have place for safe, vulnerable conversations. And I hope more Asian churches, more Korean churches can cultivate that.
Thank you. Thank you for a good closing word. So soothing for the soul. What an invitation. And grateful for your friendship too, John. So PJS Center and Church in Culture will add a link in the show notes at Erasing Shame. Look forward to seeing you in person next time. Bye-bye.
Awesome. Thanks, DJ.
Thank you for listening to the Erasing Shame podcast. Check out the show notes at erasingshame.com and subscribe to our email for updates. We would love to hear from you, so please add your comments at our website or on social. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any podcast app, and you can also subscribe on YouTube or follow on Facebook. Please add a rating and review so we can reach more people with our message of health, hope, and compassion. This podcast is the digital outreach of Christian Asian mental health.